Et donc bonjour à toutes et à tous et bienvenue à la première séance de la 3e édition du séminaire science-fiction médiation organisé par le groupe de recherche sur les enjeux de la communication, donc le GRESEC, la MSH Alpes et le CDT Origin of Life. Je suis Guylaine Guéropinet, donc maître de conférence en sciences de l'information et de la communication au GRESEC, et avec Romain Gaillard, qui est donc dans la salle, doctorant au laboratoire, nous sommes ravis de vous proposer ce nouveau cycle donc, de rencontres et de réflexions autour des sciences et de la fiction. Avant de vous présenter donc plus en détail l'édition 2023 du séminaire et la séance du jour, je vais laisser la parole à Benoît Lafont, directeur du laboratoire du GRESEC, pour un petit mot d'accueil.
Bonjour à tout le monde, merci d'être là, merci de participer. Oui, c'est la 3e édition, donc on est très heureux de la démarrer. Autour cette année de conquête spatiale et pouvoir, Guylaine va vous en parler. C'est vrai que chaque année, on essaie d'explorer des questions liées au croisement, on va dire, des discours sociaux et en particulier de la science-fiction et de regards croisés avec des scientifiques qui viennent discuter de ces discours et de ces apports pour la société. Alors, je remercie le CDT, le CD Tool, le projet IDEX Origin of Life, auquel on participe pour le financement de ce séminaire, la MSH Alpes également, pour tout son support et son aide et son soutien. Et évidemment, le GRESEC, qui est le laboratoire que je dirige et que je représente, pour son implication. Simplement, voilà, dire que c'est un séminaire qui est au croisement de plusieurs questions, des questions de communication, d'information, de médiation sur des enjeux scientifiques actuels. Voilà, donc je ne vais pas être plus long. Simplement, rappeler que voilà, dans le cadre du CDT Origin of Life, il y a eu des recherches qui ont relié la biologie, l'astronomie et puis d'autres disciplines, et en particulier des disciplines en sciences humaines et sociales, dont les sciences de la communication. Et juste pour vous informer qu'on a un dossier de revue que nous avons coordonné qui est paru il y a quelques jours, qui s'intitule Exploration Nouvelles Frontières, qui est un dossier de la revue Questions de communication et qui est consultable gratuitement en ligne sur le site Open Édition. Donc, questions de communication, exploration nouvelles frontières, où vous trouverez justement un article écrit par l'intervenante d'aujourd'hui, qui est un chapitre de son ouvrage sur les nouvelles frontières, la métaphore des nouvelles frontières, au niveau international et aux États-Unis en particulier. Et puis différentes études que nous avons pu mener sur les médiatisations, aussi bien des exoplanètes, de la mission Rosetta, que les questions des origines de la vie et de la vie extraterrestre à la télévision française et sur YouTube. Donc tout un ensemble de thématiques que je vous invite à aller consulter. Voilà, bon démarrage à ce séminaire cette année. Je laisse la parole à Guylaine.
Merci beaucoup Benoît. Donc le séminaire interdisciplinaire science-fiction médiation a été créé en 2021 par Michael Chambru et Marion Sabourdi. Il propose donc de croiser les regards de scientifiques et d'auteurs de science-fiction au prisme des sciences humaines et sociales. Ensemble, ils et elles évoquent ces allers-retours entre science et imaginaire et leur quête pour dépeindre avec précision des mondes possibles. La science-fiction, dans ce séminaire, elle est questionnée en fait comme espace de rencontre science-société et comme lieu de médiation socio-scientifique où s'affirme une science ancrée dans un monde qu'elle participe à construire entre engagement et citoyenneté scientifique. La thématique du séminaire cette année, c'est donc conquête spatiale et pouvoir. La première édition, elle était dédiée aux origines de la vie et aux exoplanètes. La deuxième était centrée sur la fiction climatique. Et cette année, nous repartons dans l'espace pour questionner les enjeux de pouvoir liés à la conquête spatiale. On peut voir en fait que la matérialisation des frontières et aussi leur délimitation vont susciter des enjeux éthiques, scientifiques et commerciaux, aussi bien en ce qui concerne les territoires que l'identité. La fiction, et on le verra durant ce séminaire, mais en particulier les space opéras, vont s'inspirer de ces thématiques pour aborder l'exploration des galaxies, la découverte, mais aussi des conflits qui sont souvent construits aux dimensions de l'humanité. Le séminaire va donc interroger différents points de vue pour comprendre les imaginaires liés au pouvoir dans l'espace, mais aussi ses réalités, dans un contexte où le voyage dans cet infiniment grand n'a jamais été autant d'actualité. On vous proposera donc 4 séances pour faire un tour d'horizon de ces questions. Le 30 mars, nous accueillerons Floriane Soulas et Olivier Poche pour parler de l'exploration du système solaire et de l'habilité des planètes. Le 20 avril, ce sera donc Robin Benassaya accompagné d'Arnaud Saint-Martin.
Ah, tu as une slide.
Ah, je me suis déjà trompée. Donc le 20 avril et pas le 27. Donc on accueillera Romain Benassaya et Arnaud Saint-Martin pour aborder les questions éthiques liées à la conquête spatiale. Et donc, vous l'avez déjà vu, mais le 27 avril, pour la 4e séance, nous aurons la chance de rencontrer Estelle Faye et Laurence Guignard pour un voyage dans les représentations que nous nous faisons du cosmos et de l'aventure spatiale. Aujourd'hui, pour cette séance donc inaugurale, nous proposons un format un petit peu différent. Nous avons en effet la chance d'accueillir Leah Ceccarelli pour une conférence sur les représentations du scientifique dans le cinéma de science-fiction. Cette présentation, elle sera suivie d'un temps de discussion mené par Benoît Lafont, et puis on aura aussi un temps de questions-réponses. Pour les personnes qui nous suivent à distance, n'hésitez pas à poser vos questions dans le chat, en français ou en anglais. Nous les relèverons et nous les poserons à Léa dans la 3e partie de la séance. Now, it's the time that I switch to English. And so for this session, an inaugural session with a slightly different format, we are lucky to welcome Leah Ceccarelli for a presentation about the figures of the scientist in science fiction cinema. Leah Ceccarelli is a professor of science communication at the University of Washington and a critic and rhetorical theorist. Her work focuses on the public discourse developed around science, and she is a visiting professor at the Grzec Lab this year. She is the author of the book On the Frontier of Science, an American Rhetoric of Exploration and Exploitation. Welcome, Leah.
Merci.
Benoît Lafont will be the discussant for this presentation, and this will surely be an opportunity to compare some American and French approaches to media analysis. Indeed, Benoît Lafont is professor of Information and Communication Sciences at Grenoble-Alpes University and director of Grzec. His research focuses on the processes of mediatization from a socio-historical, political, and societal perspective, as well as on television and online audiovisual media. He is the author of Histoire de la télévision régionale de la RTF à la 3, de 1950 à 2012, and edited the book Médias et médiatisation, analyser les médias imprimés, audiovisuels, numériques. We just have to change.
It's okay.
Good. And now that our speakers are introduced, Leah, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this seminar on science fiction mediation. Let me just begin by apologizing for speaking English. If I could speak French, I would. Unfortunately, I just don't know the language well enough to even make an attempt. I have put some French sentences in my PowerPoint with the help of an online translation service. Now, I don't know how good the grammar is on that, so forgive any errors there. And for the final part of my apology tour here, I understand that these talks are normally an exchange between science fiction authors and scientists, and I am sadly neither. I am a big fan of both, though. I'm a scholar who studies public communication of science, and so what I'm going to be talking about today is how are scientists perceived and characterized by creators of science fiction. I am going to discuss a couple of studies that I published on the subject in the Spanish Science Studies journal, Métoda. The first one came out in 2015 and was titled Scientific Ethos and the Cinematic Zombie Outbreak. This was written, of course, before coronavirus got us all talking about nothing but viral outbreaks. So I was ahead of the curve. Or rather, pop culture had anticipated our pandemic anxieties. In the article, I argued that the glut of zombie movies that had been infesting our theaters was at least partly the result of the public's fear of viral apocalypse. In these movies, zombies are almost always created from the release of a novel and highly infectious pathogen against which science has no vaccine or cure. It's a disease so deadly and contagious that civilization collapses in its wake. When I was doing this research, I had just written a whole book on how scientists construct their public ethos through the figure of the pioneer as heroic, fiercely independent men who courageously enter new knowledge territory to stake a claim to what they discover out there on the frontier of science. From Vannevar Bush's Science, the Endless Frontier, the report that spurred the foundation of the creation of the National Science Foundation for United States government funding of basic scientific research, to E.O. Wilson's image of the taxonomist as a risk-taking bioprospector, mining rare species for their hidden biological riches, to the analogy that Francis Collins repeatedly made between the Human Genome Project and Lewis and Clark's Core of Discovery. Again and again, I found scientists representing themselves in public as the inheritors of a heroic, pioneering ethos. So I wondered whether I would find a pioneering ethos in the way scientists were represented by non-scientists in fictionalized popular narratives. By the way, I find it especially satisfying to be talking in France about the figure of the scientist as frontier explorer in science fiction movies. After all, one of the most well-known early science fiction movies is Le Voyage dans la Lune by the French filmmaker Georges Méliès. It is a silent film that imagines scientists as frontier explorers. Here you see them in their collegial robes, but after a spirited debate, they pull off the robes and leave the university to make a trip to the moon in a space capsule. After wreaking havoc with the natives of the place, they return in triumphant glory with a captive moon person in tow. A statue erected to honor their expedition is seen at the end of the movie with the title Science and the motto Labor omnia vincit, or work conquers all. And thus is the ambition and effort of the scientist melded with the values of the imperialist and pioneer, ever pushing the horizons of their influence forward into new territories, or new to them anyway. The film reminds us that it's not just, as the subtitle of my book puts it, an American rhetoric of exploration and exploitation that we should be considering. Scientists are often imagined as eager colonists in other nations as well. But because my expertise is American rhetoric, my perspective will mostly reflect the American context. I'll be interested to hear, though, how you think the French context matches or complicates what I say today. Since the contemporary zombie flick bears a striking resemblance to the classic American Western film with gun-toting heroes facing off against hostile savages, I was interested in how the figure of the scientist was set out in these modern frontier narratives. Did they follow the scientist's own self-conceptualization in representing the ethos or the character of the scientist through the virtues and vices of heroic explorers and pioneers? I focused on three popular zombie blockbusters: World War Z, 28 Days Later, and I Am Legend. And my research question was, what does the portrayal of the scientist in zombie movies tell us about the way we think about scientists in our modern world? In World War Z, we actually see scientists represented as the opposite of the heroic frontiersmen. They appear as clumsy and naive, ineffectual and dangerous to themselves and others. One scientist we meet is Dr. Fassbach, a young virologist from Harvard who was initially described as our best bet at overcoming the zombie pandemic that's overtaken the world. But the real hero of the movie is UN investigator Jerry Lane, played by Brad Pitt. He's a reluctant gunslinger, forced out of retirement to accompany the tender-footed young scientist into the dangerous zombie-filled wildlands. As soon as they enter the danger zone, zombies attack. And in the virologist's rush to flee back into the safety of the military plane, he trips on the ramp and accidentally shoots himself in the head, dying instantly. Right? So much for the incompetent virus hunter, Dr. Fassbach. Toward the end of the movie, we're introduced to another scientist at a World Health Organization compound who's likewise characterized as dangerously clumsy. We see a video in which Dr. Spellman, the chief vaccinologist of the lab, contaminates himself with the virus by accidentally cutting his hand while working with a blood sample. He immediately turns into a zombie and then infects all 80 people working in his wing of the compound. And that's him on the right there, in zombie form, staring down the movie's hero. So if World War Z presents the image of the scientist as blundering fool, the next movie I looked at represents the closely related image of the scientist as victim, unable to control the outcome of his own ethically compromised work. Both of these are popular archetypes of the scientist that have been identified by science and literature scholar Rosalind Haynes. This was a theme introduced early in Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later, a 2002 movie that was really one of the first zombie pandemic films of the 21st century. At the beginning of the film, animal rights activists in ski masks break into a science lab where chimpanzees are the subject of horrifying experiments. A scrawny scientist walks in on the activists as they prepare to free the animals and stutters out a warning. "The chimps are infected," he says. "They're highly contagious." He then offers an unsolicited justification for his immoral treatment of these animals. "In order to cure, you must first understand." Well, it turns out the chimps had been infected with rage, a virus that's passed through bodily fluids and causes the infected to violently attack the uninfected, and thus pass the virus on to others. As soon as the activists release a chimp, it attacks them, and in moments, they and the scientist are all rage-infested zombies. So, scientists are being represented in these movies as naive buffoons and as immoral victims, or villains who are the victims of their own experiments. But what about the image of the scientist as frontier hero? That image that scientists are so fond of presenting in their own public discourse. Well, the third popular movie of the 21st century that I look at, it constructs the ethos of scientists as somewhat closer to how scientists like to see themselves. The stereotype of the scientist as frontiersman exists in a cinematic merger of the other two archetypes that Haynes identifies in science fiction literature: the scientist as adventurer and the scientist as hero or savior of society. This version of the scientist is found in I Am Legend, a 2007 blockbuster with Will Smith as the title character, Robert Neville, a world-famous scientist who also happens to be a high-ranking military officer with a ripped physique. Neville is the last uninfected man alive in a zombie-infested New York City, where we first encounter him there hunting deer in the abandoned and overgrown streets. He's the very image of the lonely frontiersman with a healthy respect for nature and the survival skills to avoid being caught by the roving bands of zombie savages that come out at night. But Neville is also a brilliant scientist with a well-equipped laboratory in which he works tirelessly in solitude to develop a serum that'll kill the virus. When he identifies a promising compound, he captures a zombie to use as a test subject. A wall of photos there of previous test subjects who've died in his care suggests that he's been doing this for quite some time. In the end, spoiler alert, Neville discovers a cure, but to preserve it, he has to sacrifice himself with a suicide run at the zombies who swarmed his lab. It's a martyrdom that saves an uninfected woman and child who are traveling through the city and who promise to get that cure that he has created out to the few remaining human survivors. With a beatific "I'm listening" that indicates his renewed faith in God, Neville dedicates his death to the restoration of humanity and becomes the titular legend. Scientists everywhere can feel proud of their heroic frontier avatar in this movie. But there is a more complicated image of the scientist that got cut from the authoritative version of this narrative. I Am Legend didn't always have the ending I just described. In fact, it started with a very different narrative arc that didn't test well with audiences and was thus changed. It was a version, though, that was popular enough that it can still be published or purchased as a separate disc or digital download, advertised as the alternate theatrical version with controversial ending. In this version of the movie, Neville comes to realize that the zombie savages who've invaded his lab are there to rescue the test subject that he's strapped to the table and putatively cured. Through primal war cries and crude sign language, they convey to him that they want her back. Neville's statement that "I'm listening" is now a revelation that he finally understands them and respects their right to exist. To prove this, he reinfects the test subject with the virus and lets her go. And with that act, he gives up on his attempts to assimilate her back into civilization. He says, "I'm sorry," for what he now recognizes to be his own nearly genocidal acts over the last 3 years. Neville is a legend in this version of the movie too, but a legend in a bad way. A murderer of post-human zombies whose failure to listen to his test subjects resulted in a horrifying legacy of extermination. So if you interpret the zombies in this movie metaphorically as so-called savages on the frontier wilderness, then this ending could reflect a dawning ambivalence in public culture about the American frontier myth. Connected to this new understanding of the frontier myth is a recognition that scientists should act as self-reflexive ethical agents who don't pursue every research question they want to answer. A clear-eyed understanding of the legacy of frontier exploration means that scientists on the frontiers of knowledge can't assume that it's their manifest destiny to cure everyone. They have to accept that some people might not think they're sick at all. They have to acknowledge that listening to test subjects sometimes means freeing them from science's single-minded experimental ends. The fact that this alternate version of the movie was abandoned when it tested poorly demonstrates that it's not popular in the early 20th century to see scientists in this way. They can be clumsy and dangerous, or heroic and self-sacrificing, but not critically self-reflexive. However, the fact that this alternate ending lives on in video sales suggests that at least some of us are eager for such a characterization. The thoughtfully ethical scientist is not dominant in the public imaginary, but it's encouraging to see this image isn't entirely absent from the stories that we tell when we air our anxieties about the reach and limitations of our rapid advances in science. All right, so the second study that I want to talk about today was one that I co-authored with a student, Emily Klein. This article is titled "Surpassing Our Genes, the Subversive Posthuman Message of Gattaca." The 1997 science fiction film Gattaca is named after the letters that represent the nucleotides of the genetic code, GTCA. Right? Guanine, thymine, cytosine, and adenine. Once again, my research question was, how are scientists characterized in the film? I chose Gattaca because it's become standard viewing in bioethics courses, universally interpreted as a warning against the genetic perfectionism that inspires scientists who do research on human genomics. An ad campaign that accompanied the release of the film played into public fears of human genetic engineering. Proclaiming children made to order, it purported to be an advertisement for a company named Gattaca, through which it is now possible to engineer your offspring. The ad listed traits that you could keep your child from suffering through genetic engineering, including premature baldness, addictive susceptibility, criminally aggressive tendencies, and heart disease. These happen to be the same things that a character identified in the movie as the geneticist lists as the burdens that he can keep a child from bearing. Only a tagline at the end of the ad hints that it's fake. It reads, "Unfortunately, there is no gene for the human spirit." This tagline is usually interpreted as the moral of the movie, right? Gattaca is read as a dystopian tale about the dangers of genetic determinism in a technologically advanced society. But a close look at the power of the scientist in this movie suggests that there might be another message hiding beneath its didactic veneer. On the surface, the plot of Gattaca encourages a simplistic reading of its moral structure. It follows a man, Vincent, the victor, who's naturally conceived through natural means in a society where that makes him a second-class citizen. He was not genetically engineered. Vincent wants to become an astronaut, but he's denied that job because of his genetically inferior status. So he enlists the help of Eugene, right, who is a valid, someone with superior genes, good genes, conceived through science. Eugene provides blood, urine, and other body samples that Vincent uses to fool genetic tests and pass as a valid. And it works up until the very end of the movie, when Vincent encounters an unexpected final test before entering the spaceship that promises the achievement of his dream. Luckily, the technician, Dr. Lamar, passes him through anyway, revealing that he's sympathetic to the genetically inferior Vincent. "Unfortunately," says Dr. Lamar, "my son is not all that they promised." These words from the lab-coated technician suggest that the scientists of Gattaca can't really do what they purport, that is, make children to order that inherit good traits and avoid bad ones. Recognizing this, my student and I argue that this movie isn't really about how a perfect class of genetically engineered human beings can be bested by the unmodified man who equals them through sheer force of will or human spirit, a characteristic for which there's purportedly no gene. Instead, the film tells the story of scientists who are lying when they claim they can deliver perfected humans. And there are lots of clues in the movie that this is its real message. You can see right here, Dr. Lamar, one of the valids working at Gattaca, is prematurely balding, as was Eugene, right? You can see it a little bit. He's the valid that Vincent used as a tissue donor. Eugene also shows signs of an addictive personality. He is constantly smoking and drinking. His alcoholism even becomes a plot point in the movie when he's unable to provide a clean urine sample for Vincent. Director Joseph, the leader of the space mission, when questioned about a murder that took place in the building, says with an air of outrage, "Take another look at my profile, detective. You won't find a violent bone in my body." Now, in light of the geneticist's claims early in the movie to remove the propensity for violence from the genomes of valids, this claim about the director's genetic profile, easily tested, makes it clear that at least he believes he's free of this trait. But, and here's another spoiler alert, it turns out that he is the murderer. He had viciously attacked a coworker, bashing his head in with a keyboard while yelling at him, right? His spit, discovered in the eye of the victim, is the clue that reveals his guilt. Vincent's love interest, who is also a so-called valid, has a heart condition bad enough to require medicine to keep it in check. In fact, it seems that none of the perfectionist claims of the scientists are borne out in the characters that are supposedly made to order. Now, that's not to say that the scientists are completely incompetent. There is one genetic manipulation that they prove themselves very much capable of achieving. Midway through the movie, Irene and Vincent go to a piano concert where Vincent discovers that the pianist has 6 fingers on each hand. When Irene looks admiringly at this post-human musician, Vincent tells her, somewhat defensively, 12 fingers or 1, it's how you play. She stares at him for a moment, deadpan, before replying, that piece can only be played with 12. Vincent is left speechless. His human spirit gives him no answer to the superiority of this genetically engineered virtuoso. Someone with merely 10 fingers really can't play a composition written for 12. The scene shows that the scientists of Gattaca might not be capable of perfecting the human form, but they can transcend it. They've created a post-human who stands above both the valids and the invalids. A close reading of this scene of post-human transcendence, along with the multiple hints in the movie about scientists' failure to achieve the perfection of the existing human form, changes the whole tenor of the movie. A world where the scientists really could do what they promised would be a world in which Vincent wouldn't have realized his dream, no matter how strong his human spirit, right? Dr. Lamar wouldn't have had a flawed son, so he wouldn't have been sympathetic to Vincent. The mission director wouldn't have murdered the supervisor who was planning to cancel the mission, so the mission would have been canceled. Eugene wouldn't have been an alcoholic wreck reduced to selling his bioproducts to Vincent. In each case, Vincent wouldn't have become an astronaut. So it is, in fact, the scientist's failure, not Vincent's human spirit, that allowed him to succeed. But the fact that the movie scientists can modify the human form to make it even better than perfect means that both the so-called valids and the unmodified invalids are inferior to the post-human body plan. We end up leaving the theater thinking we're getting a message about the perils of genetic perfectionism and the undaunted power of the human spirit, and we fail to notice that we've actually been soaking up a message about the promise of genetic engineering for post-human transcendence. Gattaca's scientists are both powerless to do what they say and uncannily effective at doing even more. This figure of the scientist in Gattaca, both ineffectual and powerful, tells us much about our society's complicated relationship with genetic engineering and the scientists that give us these fearful and amazing technologies. So, there you have it. Cinematic scientists can be clumsy fools, unethical villains, heroic frontiersmen, and either over-promising salespeople or uncannily powerful agents of our post-human future. The image of the scientist in the public imaginary tells us much about how we think about science, technology, and society in modern times. It's a complicated relationship that the public has with scientific experts. What's truly unfortunate, I think, is that an image of the scientist as self-reflexively critical agent, contemplating the ethics of their actions and abandoning a single-minded push across the research horizon when told by a potential research subject that the pursuit is harming a whole population of people, that view of the scientist is so foreign to our horizon of expectations that it can exist only in fugitive spaces, preserved as an alternate story about science and society for those who actively seek it out. Now, it's encouraging that it exists at all, but dispiriting that it's such a rare characterization of the scientist in the public imaginary. And this is the vision of the scientist that I'd like to see developed. In fact, it's the vision of the scientist that most of my research has been circling around lately, the figure of the scientist citizen, or the scientist as citizen. The idea behind the scientist citizen is that the public sphere and the technical sphere are not mutually exclusive spaces as they're typically pictured. Scientists might reside in the technical sphere, but they're members of the broader public too, with a duty of care towards others with whom they share that space. As I like to tell my grad students in the sciences, when you get your PhD, you don't give up your citizenship. I use the word citizen in its broad sense here, not as a legal designation, but as a descriptive term for membership in a larger discursive community, a kind of rhetorical citizenship that carries with it both rights and responsibilities. The term scientist-citizen reverses the more commonly used phrase, citizen scientist, right? The citizen scientist is the layperson who's brought into the realm of science to participate in some small way in the development of knowledge, by counting birds in the neighborhood, by monitoring air quality with homemade devices, or by playing a video game to solve protein folding puzzles. What I've been interested in lately is the reverse of this, the scientist-citizen, the scientist who moves from the isolation of the technical sphere out into the broader public sphere, embracing a civic duty to address the needs of the larger community, to be thoughtful about ethics, to engage in activism, and to unite with their colleagues in the humanities to critically assess and even reverse long-held assumptions that promote harmful practices of extraction and exploitation. It's a figure of the scientist that I'd like to see further developed in science fiction as a spur to its being further developed in science fact, in real life. Rather than just predict pandemic catastrophes, I'd like to see science fiction films inspire and promote the figure of the thoughtful, careful, ethical, and efficacious scientist-citizen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. And now, Benoît, it's your turn for the discussion.
Yes, I will just address some questions and maybe thoughts about what you told us, but it's just my own interpretation, so I hope other questions will open the topics. So what I first noticed that your approach is in France what we call either narratological, and it's about the narratives, and what we call semio-discursive. So it's a discourse analysis with picking some meanings and joining them to set on perspective some meanings that we can't correctly interpret without this methodology. So I think it's really interesting what you told us about the scientists in those movies, and these questions are central today. So what is interesting, I think, is what justifies the action. What is the purpose of these scientists? And I was thinking about I Am Legend, and what is really interesting is those two alternative endings, and I think they're really, you told us it was really different endings, and the scientific perspective is not the same in those two endings, and the legend is not the same. And I noted hyper-anthropocentric or open to new forms of human or post-human life. It's really maybe the opposite. And what I was thinking, it's because I read the book some years ago, and your presentation, I had to see again what the book is about precisely, because I remembered the ending of the book in 1954 from Richard Matheson, and describes a man condemned to death by a new vampire civilization. And they are not zombies, they are vampires, and those new vampires have their own society, new society. And the legend is the last man on earth who's condemned, yes, to death, penalty. And that's the question: who is the hero in the Richard Matheson movie? The legend is no more a hero, and what's interesting is that Hollywood cinema made a frontiersman, and that's really it's more the opposite than the alternate ending. So I'd like to hear you about that, maybe. I don't know if we just interact now, and after that I just have some other questioning, but maybe to finish with the I Am Legend. Yes, I wrote some thoughts. I wrote an ordinary man who becomes a legend, the last man on earth, and from 1954 to the present day, could we expand the question? In other words, the end of humanity, which is at the heart of the subject, becomes a question in which the scientist is nowadays omnipresent. But there wasn't scientist in 1954 about this question, and now the scientist is responsible of the end, maybe of humanity. And in I Am Legend, I remember the beginning of the pandemic was a cancer cure
Yes.
that didn't turn well. Cancer cure failed and humanity is destroyed. So scientist is the origin
Yep.
of the of the ill, and scientist at the end is the master of humanity.
Yes.
So what could you tell us not her us about that?
Yes. No, I should have brought in. Yes, Dr. Crippen is the scientist who discovers a cure for cancer, which then becomes actually the cause of the pandemic, the zombie pandemic. So.
And what's incredible, it's that COVID crisis
Yes.
threw to our faces all those questionings.
Well, yeah, it makes me think that really a lot of these movies now, and it's not just the zombie pandemic movies, which I mean continue, and zombie pandemic television shows, right? The Last of Us is the most recent popular one. That they all have to do with the end of civilization, right? And I think that you might think about, instead of just zombie movies, think about maybe another study for me to do, or for a social scientist to do, who would do it in a much more systematic way, is to look at the end of human civilization. That's the concern. It's sort of the apocalypse, which is always caused by scientists, or almost always caused by scientists. Either they create the pathogen, or they're just unable to respond to it, unable to find a solution to it. Like Don't Look Up is another example. That sort of satire that came out recently with the asteroid. The scientists are completely ineffectual. They see the danger, but they're completely ineffectual at public communication, and so aren't able to stop the end of the world. So asteroid movies, the Jurassic Park series, right? Everything is all the end of humans.
And isn't it a way to mark someone to be responsible?
Yes.
But because there aren't in those movies, maybe yes, in some movies villains are industrials, James Bond movies, for example. But scientists, I think sometimes they replace industrials in those kind of movies to be the evil, to be the responsible for destruction.
Yes, if they're not the leaders of the capitalist industry that is responsible, they're working for them.
Yes.
And I mean, I think that these all reflect our concerns, and legitimate concerns, perhaps, about the power and influence of scientists in the modern world.
Yeah.
And I think being critical of scientists, they are, right? That scientists they know not what they do. From the scientists who gave us nuclear bombs, to the scientists who create the technologies that have combustion engine, created global climate change.
Yes.
The scientists, I mean, all of these things are a result of the expansion of knowledge, which also coincides with potentially the end of us.
And I think your studies are really connected to all the growth of ethical perspectives and questionings in science today.
Yeah.
There are lots of questions about ethics. And the second point I wanted to discuss is about the figure of the scientist you mentioned, and maybe a difference between USA and France, or are there some difference? Because I looked at some, there are some paper journals about scientists in France, scientist representations of the scientists. But the French journal papers have lots of examples from the US movies, so it's not really relevant. But I think in France we have, you showed George Méliès, and I was thinking during this, at the same, I was thinking about Jules Verne in the same context. And in Jules Verne novels, there are lots of engineers and American frontiersmen too. I think in From Earth to the Moon, or in The Mysterious Island, everything begins in the United States during the Civil War, etc. So the influence of US scientists in French representation is huge. And I don't know, maybe in the audience someone has some ideas about is there a specific way to represent scientists in France? But I don't think so. Maybe there is a difference. In France, I think scientists appear more like laboratory men. I told you in France there is a movie who has a huge success, is Back to the Future, and the mad scientist is a classic figure. But scientists as a laboratory man and not frontiersman. It's not. We don't represent scientists. Maybe scientists in documentary, yes, but not in frontiersman movies about pioneers and all those kind of stuff. It's because we aren't a nation founded on the exploitation of new frontiers, new territories. But yes, that would be a matter for discussion. And yes, maybe.
Yes, it's fascinating. I mean, the term frontier has an American, like there's an American definition of that, yes, which is the line separating civilization from uncivilized lands, right?
To the west.
To the west, that's right. And of course, those lands actually were populated. They were not wilderness lands, but that's the way they were thought of by the, English-speaking white writers of the dictionaries. That's what frontier means. Unlike, I think, in the French context, a frontier is it's like a line between two countries.
Yes.
Right?
It's
a border between
yes,
two civilized places.
Yes.
And so that Americanism of frontier, I think I can apologize again, has infected how scientists are perceived, not just in America, but I think, American cultural hegemony with our movies and everything else has shaped how we think about science elsewhere. Because that frontier of science metaphor and myth kind of combines the idea of the lab with the exploration out in the pioneering activity. Yeah. I think back to Francis Bacon's original distinction of natural philosophy into the pioneers and the smiths. The pioneers were the ones who were out on the front lines doing the exciting, what we would call basic research. And the smiths were the engineers who took that knowledge and then tinkered and made things out of it that would be productive. But what was so effective with Vannevar Bush's use of this frontier, endless frontier of science idea is that in a way, it combined those so that the pioneer, the exciting basic scientific researcher would automatically have products coming from that basic scientific research, that it's unquestioned, that there would be broader impacts that come from basic scientific research. And I think that ends up melding in some way, the the scientist, the laboratory scientist, which ironically in this case is the one who's going out into the frontier, and the more technical, practically oriented, here's how I'm going to turn this thing into a product for you to use, you know, the cell phones and the earphones and that come from the basic science research at the frontiers of exploration.
Yes.
So I think that those things end up getting melded in a way that maybe they weren't in the past. I don't know.
Yes, I don't know either. And last question I would like to ask is, by hearing you, I thought, finally, aren't scientists reduced to engineering figures or genius tinkerers? And scientists are always engineering solutions, etc., but they don't seem to think about the social perspective of their discoveries. And the philosophers or the thinkers or other figures, maybe religious figures or philosophers. And I was surprised because doesn't this say a lot about the split between science and philosophy? And maybe isn't there a lack of understanding of the social sciences? Because social sciences are, scientist is a scientist in certain fields, not social fields. So what can we say about that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think if you look at the trip to the moon,
Yes.
We see, and again in a French context, there's the scientists as philosophers, right?
Yes.
They're wearing their robes, they've got their wigs on, and they're debating. And they get into like this real heated debate. And then they bizarrely start undressing, right? I was watching this movie, I'm like, what the heck? Why are they taking their robes off? It's because they're now preparing to become the engineers,
Yes.
right? To enter the world and do something outside of the ivory tower. And so I think that, you know, even there we see those two characteristics of the scientist melded. They are separated from the world, but they're also actors in the world. I guess what I'm trying to do is to bring in the social sciences and the humanities to say that in both guises there needs to be thoughtful reflection about what the implications of what they're doing might be, right? So that there's not this assumption that if there's some space, it needs to be filled with the scientists, right? If there's some knowledge territory that we don't know about, we don't know something, then there's this assumption. The value is we need to populate that, right? We need to exploit it. And I think that it is the scholars of the humanities and the social scientists who could whisper in the ear of the natural scientist. Here's some possibilities.
And in the ears of the people who give money to the project. So when the states, when the governments, when it's public money or when it's private money, as it is in social space exploration. SpaceX, Amazon, and Musk and Bezos are today major actors in this field. So whispering in those ears can be more difficult. Maybe.
Well, and I'm not suggesting that scholars of the humanities and the social sciences have all the answers.
Yes.
But you know, we are looking at what the possibilities are. We can't predict the future. No. But science fiction authors are the same way, right? Science fiction authors can give us an idea of what the possibilities are in the future. And that can help us to think through what we're doing now.
Yes.
And I think can provide models for how we might want to behave. And when those models are all negative, all really problematic, that's when I get worried. I would like to see some positive models. And the positive models I don't think are the heroic frontiersmen, but what I think of as the more heroic frontier character,
Yes,
the
yes.
second Will Smith
Yes.
version,
Yes.
where the scientist does something truly courageous and gives up on his life assumptions, like makes a change and realizes that his single-minded life pursuit to save one version of humanity may not be the right one.
Okay, thank you. And that's where we have a word with really fashion mode word. It's acceptability. In France, we have lots of research about acceptability. Acceptability. I don't know if no, acceptability, but maybe that was a barbarism. A bad word. Translate acceptability. How make the citizens and people accept acceptability. Yes, yes. It's lots of research projects claim to produce social acceptability because of the but acceptability can be for the best or for the worst. So it's social science has responsibilities too for the acceptability of good things and not bad things.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that that's really important, especially in our current era where there seems to be, at least in my country, a war on science from the political right. You do need to help the public accept science as a source of truth, as a source of facts. But I get worried when too much of what the social scientists and the humanities scholars do is provide this public understanding of science model that says, oh, if only the public would understand science, everything would be well, because that, of course, misses out on the critical angle that that their colleagues in the ivory tower can offer, which is sometimes science needs to be stopped. It's not. So I think of myself as, like I said at the beginning, a fan of science. I am a technophile. I love my phone. I love VR. I love technology. I love science. And a lot of times I find myself defending scientists in the public sphere against attacks on them from political figures. But I also think it's really important that scientists be critical as well. And so sometimes I find myself like critiquing scientists by saying, no, that's not, you need to think further, right? E.O. Wilson, bioprospecting, that's just not a really great way of thinking about what biodiversity preservation should be all about.
Yes.
So that's one of the things that, as a rhetorician, as a scholar of rhetoric, I feel like I feel good about. It depends on the situation. It's all adapting to the individual case. There are some cases where scientists need to be critiqued, brought down a notch or two, and there are some times when scientists
we have to critique criticism.
Yeah, where we need to help the public to accept, to be more accepting of science. There needs to be more public acceptability and public understanding of science.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these exchanges. And we have 20 minutes for questions. So if you have any question in the audience or in the YouTube chat, please do not hesitate. Robin, do we have any questions in the chat?
Not
in the audience? Yes, Alex.
First, thank you very much for all of this. It was fascinating. I will try to ask my question, but it needs maybe a lot of context, so I will try to be clear. So, as I used to understand Gattaca, the main focus I saw was on the anti-eugenics, opinion. I don't know. So it's, I think, the first level of understanding of the movie, and so everyone is like, yeah, eugenics are wrong. So it's common knowledge, and in I Am Legend, the alternate ending, for me it's the same idea. So my question is, why the, sorry, I'm a little stressed out. Why, can you explain, do you have hints to explain why the alternate ending of I Am Legend was not popular, and at the same time Gattaca was popular with the first level of understanding? Is it because eugenics feel like a big step in comparison with vaccines, or I don't know, just curing disease or something like that? Do you have an idea?
Yes, a very good question. I think that surface reading of Gattaca, I don't want to dismiss it, because it's clearly what how audiences interpreted the film and what it was meant, probably by its authors, by its creators, to produce. But I do think there's this subversive message that maybe even the producers didn't realize they had inserted in the movie, that promotes this sort of post-human message. And I think that post-human message is what was in the I Am Legend alternate ending version, right? That we need to accept the idea that there are this other kind of human, the zombie vampires or whatever, the fast-moving zombies, and give up on humanity. I think that's what made that second one so difficult for people to accept. Was it was controversial because it didn't seem like a happy ending to humans watching the movie. And it was so clear that was what that version meant to say. You don't see the end of humanity as a positive in these movies. But I don't know, maybe if that's where we're not going. I mean, it's interesting that both of those movies end up with this post-human theme. And as we look at the dangers that we're facing in our modern world, I'm thinking now of the singularity. Our AI overlords are going to be surpassing us very soon. Does that become like the replacement for humanity, or do we create a post-human alternative that is able to compete or is able to survive our new global climate change environment? I think that these are the questions that movies will be asking and trying to answer. I also wonder if maybe that alternate ending movie might have been just a little ahead of its time. That it might, and the fact that it lives on suggests that there is an audience out there for it, right? I wonder if maybe it would have a more receptive audience now than it did when it first came out. I don't know. I like it better. I think it's a much better movie. And a much more interesting message. But yeah, I don't want to dismiss the anti-eugenicist surface reading of Gattaca. I think that's accurate. But there's this between the lines message with that 12-fingered human, which, I mean, a lot of people who've written about the movie say that the 12-fingered human was really uncanny, right? That it made them feel sick. And yet the narrative of the movie is, you know, he was superior. Clearly, he was, you know, the virtuoso. No one could match him.
Which is weird because people with 12 fingers exist, and we tend to cut them. I don't know how to say it.
Yes, to make them more
normal.
Yeah.
And that's weird for me because it's like we don't do that. We don't want them to exist now, and it's the post-human thing also at the same time. So I don't know where I'm going, but.
Well, I mean, the thing I keep thinking about with that movie is like, what would happen? What happens in the future for Gattaca, right? We see the characters. It's a very stylish movie, right? They're dressed so nicely, and they walk onto the spaceship like wearing suits, and I'm like, what the heck? It's like, what kind of environment are they going to face in space that they want to wear these stylish business suits? You know, that part of the movie always boggled my mind, but it's like, you know, if the scientists of Gattaca can actually change the human body plan to make it have more fingers so it can play better music, it's going to have to create humans that can better survive in space, right? That have a body plan that can handle lack of gravity. This body plan doesn't work too well in space. So that's my imagining of Gattaca 2, the sequel, would have the scientists creating the post-human space explorers. But yeah, it's a subject I hadn't realized until recently how much the post-human inflected both of those studies, both of those papers of mine.
We are talking about science fiction, but Hyperion by Dan Simmons is he imagines extras who are humanity that has evolved around planets, and there is a war between human and extras. So those kind of
I've always wanted to read that, and I haven't. But I did watch The Expanse. Had anyone here seen The Expanse? Where and read the books, or at least the first one, where the people who like are born and live in the asteroid belt. They can't come to Earth because their bodies haven't grown up in gravity, and so, but they're much more adapted to the non-gravity environment. So I think that these things are really interesting.
We'll discuss this later in other sessions.
Thank you.
Any question in the audience?
Thank you for your presentation. I have one little question, because your presentation makes me think about the case of Dr. Fauci in the US, because we see there were many critical point of views against Dr. Fauci, even some of conspiracy stories against him. And what I'm curious about is, I mean, do you have some observation about how the scientific fiction movies impact the public opinion towards the scientists like Dr. Fauci?
Yeah.
I mean, if we go more further, I mean, what I wonder that the role of the researchers like here working on the scientific communication domain, how you work for promoting the real information, the scientific information towards the public, facing on the calc of informations. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for bringing up Dr. Fauci. Actually, I think of him as a really good example of a scientist citizen, a scientist who recognizes his responsibility to communicate with the public, to educate the public, to listen to the public. So he was, really well known for his work in AIDS, on AIDS, where he was critiqued really rather harshly by the community, the gay community of people who had AIDS. And instead of responding by reacting against them, his response was to listen, right? And change the way that the science was done so that they could bring out research before it was absolutely ready because people were dying. So I think Fauci is a great example. Interestingly, Fauci had an education in rhetoric. He was well trained in rhetoric, and I think did a wonderful job during a very difficult time of managing this situation of, at the beginning of the pandemic, he was working for Donald Trump's White House, and he did, I think, a pretty good job of keeping his job, even though there was, the administration that he worked for was very anti-science. And he did it through rhetoric. He was able, I've written an article on this in the journal Philosophy and Rhetoric, where I talk about his ability to be strategically ambiguous so that he could appeal to both the political right and the political left. And he did it very well for a very long time. Eventually, it didn't work. I mean, eventually it broke down and the right really came out against him, the political right. But for a while there, yeah, he kept his job. Even in the Trump administration, was able to restrain Trump from some of his worst impulses with respect to the pandemic science. So I think Fauci is a hero. I think very highly of him. Ultimately, now he is just, I think, savaged by the political right. But for a very long time, for a while there anyway, not a long time, for a while there, he was using his rhetorical sensibility to listen to the public and to adapt and adjust science to the public and the public to science in a way that I thought was praiseworthy.
Thank you.
Robin, have you got a question?
It's a bit quiet on YouTube, but I have a question. I'd like to hear more about the over-promising, the scientific failure shown in your lecture of Gattaca. Do you notice a tendency in movies to show the limits of science in contradiction of the idea of unlimited progress, human improvement, or science as a frontier without limit? Do you feel like recent sci-fi movies are more about to close or to open the frontiers of science?
Yeah. I think that the movies are almost always about that tension between the power of science and its failures, right? the Gattaca movie is an example, right? The failure of science to perfect the human form, but the success of the science to create this post-human form. The Jurassic Park movies, right? I mean, it's like wonder, wow, they brought back dinosaurs, how amazing! But then, oops, they thought that they had kept them from reproducing, but they reproduce, right? So I think that it's often that it's that tension between the scientists' abilities and failures that creates the plot point that makes the science fiction movies work, and that's legit. Scientists are both very powerful and not all powerful. They have, they overpromise, but then they also just wow me. So I guess I don't think that's wrong. I don't think that's a problem. I want to nudge the science fiction authors and therefore the scientists and potentially the public in ways that I happen to think are more positive, effective, useful. But I can't say for sure. I need to make sure that I recognize my own limitations as well. My recommendations are based on, philosophy, thinking, but they're not accurate predictions. I'm making arguments, and some of them will be persuasive, some of them will be right, some of them won't. But that's kind of what we do in the academy is think and debate and try to make things better.
I have a little question too.
Yes.
Something quite intriguing in sci-fi cinema in general, when showing scientists, is a place of women.
Yes.
Indeed, even in Gattaca, Irene does not have an important role in the resolution of the plot. And have you studied some of the trajectories of female scientists in film, maybe in movies about astronomy? I think about Eleanor Arroway in Contact, or Louise Banks in The Arrival, and maybe Ryan Stone in Gravity.
Yes. I have not studied those, but those do seem like they would be valuable. I mean, if you think about the I Am Legend movie, which again I didn't put it, I should have put that in. The character, I think it played by Emma Thompson, Dr. Crippen, who creates the cancer cure from a measles. I think it used a measles virus to as the carrier of this cancer cure that then becomes the zombie pandemic. That's an example of a woman scientist. They're rare, but when they do appear, I think they appear with the same. At least in that case, it appeared with the same stereotypes that we have of scientists, male scientists. One of the arguments that I make in my book on the frontier of science metaphor is that metaphor makes it hard for women to really see themselves as scientists, because the frontier hero is a male, for the most part, courageous, rugged individualist. It's actually not an accurate representation of what science is, right? Science is not individual work. You work in huge teams. You have to be able to communicate, right? The kind of lone Western, quiet Western guy who doesn't really speak much. That's not going to work in science. You need to be able to communicate with your colleagues in the lab. So I think that there are some real disadvantages to that frontier metaphor. There are advantages, but there are disadvantages, and one of them is it discourages women from seeing themselves as scientists. So Again, I haven't looked at the movies that you mentioned. I've watched them, but I haven't thought about how the figure of the scientist might be changed in a movie where the scientist, the central scientific figure is a woman. That seems like a really good research project.
Thank you. A last question in the room? No? In the chat? No? So, thank you again, Leah. Thank you, Benoît.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
And I lost my papers. Oh. So we thank you very, very much for your interventions. And I can switch to French. La séance touche à sa fin et nous remercions donc nos intervenants, mais aussi le public présent donc dans la salle, mais aussi sur YouTube. Nous remercions aussi donc la MSH Alpes pour son aide, en particulier donc Laurence Raphaël et Eva Villa, tout comme le GRESEC et le CDT Origin of Life pour leur soutien pour la mise en place de séminaires. Nous vous donnons donc rendez-vous à toutes et à tous pour la deuxième séance donc, qui se passera ici même à la MSH Alpes, mais aussi sur YouTube, donc le 30 mars de 10h à 11h30. Nous décollerons enfin pour l'espace avec Floriane Soulas, donc, qui est romancière et ingénieure, donc romancière de science-fiction et de fantasy. Et nous accueillerons aussi Olivier Poche, qui est donc planétologue, chargé de recherche CNRS et membre de l'équipe Planéto à l'Institut de planétologie et d'astrophysique de Grenoble, l'IPAG. Nous parlerons donc, je le disais tout à l'heure, exploration du système solaire et habitabilité des planètes. Et vous retrouverez toutes les informations relatives à cette séance sur le site internet de la MSH, sur le site internet du GRESEC, mais aussi en nous suivant sur Twitter au hashtag SFMGRE. Nous vous remercions de nouveau et nous vous souhaitons une bonne journée. Merci beaucoup.